The 27th millennium marked the golden age of the Galactic Alliance Empire, an unstoppable force consisting of dozens of technologically, strategically, and biologically superior species. For thousands of years, they had conquered countless worlds, crushed every civilization that stood in their way, assimilated the weak, and annihilated the defiant. Order in the galaxy was maintained through their absolute dominance. But then, an unexpected anomaly appeared, an insignificant species from a mediocre planet in the outer rim. They were called humans. At first glance, humans were unremarkable. Their bodies were frail, lacking the armored exoskeletons of the Xel'Naga. They had no regenerative abilities like the Varric, nor the superior intellect of the Eldari. They couldn't communicate telepathically, like the Tsar, or match the raw physical strength of the Krorg. But there was one thing about them that terrified every other species. They did not die like they were supposed to. When the Alliance first discovered humans, they were classified as a lower life form useful only as slaves or test subjects. The first humans captured during planetary conquest were sent to labor camps on resource extraction worlds under the control of the Alliance. The working conditions were brutal. Toxic atmospheres, lethal radiation, extreme temperatures, conditions that had wiped out millions of slaves from other species before them. But the humans did not die. They should have perished within weeks. But they didn't. At first, the alien scientists believed their monitoring equipment was malfunctioning. They checked again. No errors. The humans were still alive. Not just alive, they were adapting. On mining worlds with unbreathable air, humans quickly developed ways to extract sustenance from sources no other species could consume. They fashioned tools out of scrap, repaired machinery that even their overseers barely understood. When injured, they devised primitive but effective medical treatments. When their kin fell, they did not merely mourn, they learned. They studied death itself to ensure that the same mistakes would not be made twice. The Alliance overseers began noticing something disturbing. Humans were not dying as expected, so they escalated the experiments. Thousands of humans were abandoned on planets where no life should have been possible. They were dropped onto desert worlds where daytime temperatures could incinerate flesh. Instead of perishing, they dug deep beneath the sand, finding ways to extract moisture from the arid ground. They were exiled to frozen wastelands where blood would freeze solid in minutes. But they built fires, fashioned clothing from available materials, and trained their bodies to withstand the cold. They were thrown onto battlefields deemed unwinnable, where entire armies of other species had been slaughtered in hopelessness. But the humans did not just survive. They fought back. At first, the Alliance generals dismissed it as coincidence. But as more and more reports emerged of humans surviving impossible conditions, coincidence turned into something much worse. A nightmare. A scout unit was stranded on an abandoned world with no supplies, no weapons. 2 months later, they were found alive, having built a fortress out of the wreckage of enemy ships. A group of human slaves was sent to a uranium-rich mining planet, where no species had ever survived longer than a year due to lethal radiation. When Alliance officials returned 3 years later, they didn't find corpses. They found humans, not just alive but thriving. This was not supposed to happen, but it did. The Alliance's strategic council was shaken. They had conquered the most formidable civilizations in the galaxy, but never before had they encountered a species that refused to die the way they were supposed to. Why? Why could a species so biologically weak continue to persist? They weren't immortal. They weren't immune to death. But when placed in an environment that should have been fatal, they didn't perish like other species. They adapted. They changed. They endured. No other species functioned like this. Other civilizations depended on natural advantages, on favorable environments. If stripped of those, they would perish. Humans didn't need any of that. They just needed time. And as long as even one human remained, they could never be eradicated. When word of this spread across the Alliance, fear took root. The species that had once been dismissed as weak were no longer viewed as insignificant. They were an anomaly in the natural order, a species that should not exist. A new title was given to them, not because they were truly immortal, but because they survived when they shouldn't. The Temporary Immortals. Dolvar, a planet so hostile that even the most notorious conquerors of the Alliance dared not set foot on it. It wasn't a barren world due to lack of value. On the contrary, it was once considered a potential treasure trove of rare minerals. However, previous attempts to exploit its resources had ended in disaster. Its atmosphere was filled with a toxic mix of gases capable of penetrating any biological protective layer. The water on the planet wasn't water, but sulfuric acid, a substance capable of corroding most alloys within hours. The native wildlife was not only aggressive, but also possessed a strange biological mechanism that allowed them to absorb and adapt to any threat they faced. The Alliance's expeditionary forces had tried to colonize Dolvar, but all of them were wiped out in less than 2 weeks. So when the Alliance Council decided to use this planet for a human experiment, many saw it as a death sentence. No one survived on Dolvar for more than a month. No one. They didn't send ordinary humans. They chose a team of Earth's elite special forces, the best warriors humanity had to offer. The reason was simple. If even the strongest humans couldn't survive, it would mean that all the stories about their adaptability were nothing more than exaggerated nonsense. A team of 12 was dropped on a Dolvar with nothing but standard uniforms, a few acid-resistant ceramic daggers, and a single mission: survive. Week 1. Dolvar showed no mercy. The moment the Special Forces team landed, the toxic gases immediately began eating away at their protective clothing. But they didn't panic. One of the soldiers, survival expert Jack Vance, noticed something. The toxic gas wasn't the main issue. It was how their bodies were reacting to it. They quickly dug a temporary shelter underground, where the gas concentration was lower, and began experimenting with ways to protect themselves. They used tree sap from one of the native species, something that, in theory, should not have survived in such an environment, to coat their skin, creating a natural protective layer against the toxic gas. When the first acid storm hit, they didn't run. They observed, noting how the native creatures sought shelter and mimicked their behavior. After 7 days, they were no longer struggling to survive. They began to adapt. Week 2. Food became an issue. Nothing was edible by Alliance standards. But humans didn't need standards. They tested every native creature, every type of fungus, every bacteria. They didn't eat right away. They experimented, using their bodies as living laboratories. Some became ill, but they didn't die. They recorded the symptoms, found ways to detoxify, and turned what was once poisonous into sustenance. The Alliance monitors began to feel uneasy. Other species would have panicked, tried to escape, or given in to despair. But humans did not. They didn't wait for anyone to save them. They understood that no one was coming, and because of that, they made the planet their territory. Week 3. The native creatures began attacking, but not in the usual way they learned from the humans' actions. A predatory species that usually operated only at night began appearing during the day, adapting its ambush tactics. A parasitic species started attempting to infiltrate their shelter, using the very materials the humans had collected to spread. The Alliance overseers started to smile. It seemed that, at last, even humans had their limits. No one could fight against a planet that actively fought back. But then, they were horrified to realize humans weren't resisting. They were evolving. Instead of trying to eradicate the native species, they learned from them. They observed how the predators adapted and began mimicking them. They changed their movements, altered their hunting strategies, and adapted their tactics daily. The overseers gasped, "They're not just surviving, they're becoming part of the planet." Week 4. By now, the humans should have been dead. But when the scanners searched for life signs, they didn't detect 12 survivors. They detected a new population. The life forms the scanners gathered data on were no longer just humans. They had changed. The Special Forces soldiers no longer wore Alliance uniforms. They wore armor made from the native creatures' shells, coated with an organic substance to protect against the toxic air. They didn't just use crude tools. They had learned to craft weapons from materials that couldn't even be identified. Some had even altered their respiratory systems to endure the atmosphere without any protective gear. What had started as a simple experiment had become a nightmare. The Alliance wanted to test humanity's survival capabilities, but they made a deadly mistake. Humans didn't just resist the harsh environment, they became part of it. The Alliance Council ordered the immediate termination of the experiment, but it was too late. When the reconnaissance ship arrived to retrieve whatever remained of the Special Forces team, a horrifying sight awaited them. The humans didn't rush to the ship to be rescued. They stared at the vessel from afar, their eyes no longer those of test subjects, but the eyes of predators. Dulvar was no longer a barren planet. It had become a nightmare battlefield. From orbit, the Alliance overseers looked down, witnessing the consequences of their desperate actions. The forests that had once been scorched were growing back, but in a different way. Species thought to have been eradicated were reappearing with new traits. But what terrified them the most wasn't the planet's rebirth, it was the rebirth of humanity. A kill order was issued the moment the Alliance realized that the special forces left behind on Dulvar were not just surviving, they were evolving. But even with their most powerful weapons of destruction, all they received in return was failure. First strike, biological bombs. The Alliance dropped the most lethal virus strains ever created onto the planet's surface. These pathogens had caused entire ancient Alliance civilizations to collapse in the past. They were designed to attack all forms of organic life, spreading quickly and mutating continuously to prevent any attempt at resistance. But then they noticed something strange. The virus didn't spread as expected. The Special Forces groups didn't just survive, they became stronger. At first, the overseers thought the virus had failed, but as they collected data, they realized something worse. Humans had learned to control it. They didn't destroy the virus, they used it. Some of the survivors deliberately infected themselves to stimulate the evolution of their immune systems. Others extracted the toxic properties of the virus to coat their weapons, creating a biological weapon that even alien species couldn't resist. There was no doubt now. The Alliance had inadvertently given humanity a new advantage. Second strike, ecosystem annihilation. Realizing the virus was ineffective, the Alliance moved to a more brutal tactic: burn the planet. They used thermonuclear weapons to completely wipe out any areas showing signs of life. Forests were reduced to ash. Acid rivers evaporated, and the entire ecosystem was wiped out in a matter of days. They believed that if humanity had no place to hunt, nothing to eat, they would starve to death. But humans didn't die. They emerged from the ashes, stronger than ever. When the planet lost its resources, they didn't panic. They found ways to recycle everything left behind. The burnt shells of native creatures were smelted into heat-resistant armor. The dust from the forest became fertilizer for new crops. They grew from seeds found in the remains of the native wildlife. They didn't just survive the catastrophe, they learned to control it. Third strike, cutting off supply lines. The Alliance decided to leave no way for humanity to escape or receive help from the outside. They deployed a blockade fleet, cutting off any possible supplies. They ensured no ship could land, no signal could be transmitted. They believed humans couldn't sustain themselves forever. Eventually, they would collapse. But humanity never waited. What stunned the Alliance was that, even isolated, humans continued to develop. They were no longer just a group of special forces left behind. They had become a tribe, a civilization, a force. The survivors on Dulvar had figured out how to create agriculture in the harshest conditions, built sturdy shelters, and even started to industrialize. They used the wreckage of the fallen Alliance ships to create tools. They scavenged the remnants of war and recycled them into new weapons. The Alliance overseers watched the footage and realized a terrifying truth. They were facing a rising civilization. Wherever they were defeated, they came back stronger. Whenever they were destroyed, they were reborn. The Alliance War Council began to panic. The top strategists were no longer drafting attack plans. They were searching for ways to stop humanity before it was too late. And after months of battle, they came to an even more horrifying realization. No matter how many humans they killed, no matter how much they destroyed, humanity's legacy would never fade. Even if one fell, their knowledge would continue to spread. Even in death, they still won. The Alliance Empire could not accept defeat. They mobilized their entire fleet to Earth, determined to erase the planet from the galactic map. There was no warning, no ultimatum. When the Alliance fleet entered the solar system, the battle had begun. The moment the Alliance's flagship Vazal emerged from its hyperspace jump, its warning system immediately lit up with a series of red signals. Thousands of armed satellites, from automated plasma cannons to remote-controlled asteroid mines, fired simultaneously. The Alliance fleet barely had time to stabilize their formation before being ambushed. Explosions rocked the vacuum of space, and searing light incinerated escort ships before they could deploy their shields. In an instant, the galaxy witnessed a fury like never before. But that was just the opening act. From deep beneath the surface of the moon, human warships rose. No longer were these solitary ships, facing the mighty Alliance fleet like in past battles. Now, humanity had a fleet of its own. They had learned from their enemies. They had dismantled and improved upon alien technology, blending it with their own boundless creativity. The ships were ugly, misshapen, but far more terrifying than anything the Alliance had ever faced. Fire from the moon swept across space like a storm of flames, striking directly at the Alliance's formation. Destroyers were torn apart in an instant, colossal ships ripped to shreds by weapons crafted by humanity specifically to destroy everything in sight. But what truly sent the Alliance into panic wasn't humanity's fleet. It was how they fought. They didn't keep a safe distance. They charged straight at the enemy. What are they doing? The Alliance commanders screamed in horror as they saw human ships accelerate, crashing straight into their formation. This wasn't a typical battle. This was a massacre. Human warships showed no fear. When they ran out of ammo, they used their ships themselves as weapons. Collisions created massive fireballs in space, incinerating countless Alliance warships. But that wasn't all. As the Alliance fleet tried to reorganize, an anomalous wave appeared on their radar. Special forces. They've boarded. From the shadows of debris, from the wreckage of damaged ships, human special forces surged forward. They didn't use landing craft. They didn't deploy by conventional tactics. They jumped straight from empty space onto the enemy's ships. Impossible. Are they skydiving into the void? Other species couldn't do this. But humans? They didn't care. Clad in advanced pressure armor, human warriors clung to the hulls of ships, using their bare hands to break open airlocks and infiltrate the Alliance command vessels. No distance, no defense, only slaughter. The corridors of the Alliance command ships were drenched in blood. Human special forces advanced step by step, unstoppable. They were not afraid. They did not hesitate. They knew that even in death, they would pass on their fighting spirit to those behind them. And that was something the Alliance could never defeat. As the last of the Alliance ships exploded in the void, as fragments fell through Earth's atmosphere like dying stars, a new era began. An era in which the entire galaxy would remember. Humanity never surrenders. The war was no longer just an invasion. It had become a nightmare. At first, the Alliance believed that with their overwhelming force, they could crush humanity in a matter of days, maybe weeks at most. But then a month passed, 2 months, half a year. The Alliance fleet slowly began to disintegrate. Their logistical worlds were exhausted from trying to sustain an endless war. Senior commanders began to panic, not because of military losses, but because one horrifying truth was becoming clearer. Humanity cannot be destroyed. Guerrilla warfare among the stars the Alliance had once prided themselves on possessing the most advanced war technology in the galaxy. But on Earth, technology didn't matter. They had enormous ships with firepower capable of flattening entire planets, but that didn't mean anything when the enemy refused to stay still. At first, they used mass destruction tactics bombing from orbit, destroying every major city, erasing every command center. But humanity didn't surrender. They simply vanished. The Alliance's state-of-the-art radar systems scanned the surface of the planet, but all they found was a deadly silence. But just when they thought they had won, the attacks began. Supply stations were destroyed. Destroyers were stolen. Soldiers were murdered in the night. At first, they thought it was the remnants of humanity, but then they realized something far worse. This wasn't resistance. This was guerrilla warfare. Humanity didn't organize large-scale attacks. They struck in small groups, attacked, and then disappeared without a trace. They dug tunnels beneath the earth, using the rubble as their base. They stole the enemy's weapons and turned them against their masters. Every time the Alliance thought they had the situation under control, everything burst into flames again. These monsters don't know fear. The soldiers of the Alliance were no weaklings. They were warriors who had conquered hundreds of worlds. They had wiped out civilizations with technology far more advanced than humanity's. But on Earth, they became the prey. They weren't used to an enemy that feared nothing. They captured a human special forces operative and interrogated him. They asked him why humanity kept fighting when there was no chance of victory. He simply laughed and replied, "Victory? Who told you we need to win? We just need you to lose." And they lost. Elite squads were wiped out in sudden ambushes. Senior officers disappeared overnight, leaving only blood-soaked walls. Powerful armies became the hunted. They began to fear the dark. They began to fear the smallest of sounds. They began to fear the very thought that humanity was still alive. They are not immortal, but they never disappear. One day, the Alliance Empire received a signal from their fleet on Earth. "We need reinforcements." No one responded. There were no reinforcements left. The war was no longer a conquest. It had become an endless nightmare where the Alliance had only one choice left: retreat. They could not destroy humanity. They could not extinguish the flame of resistance. They could not defeat an enemy that, even in death, passed on their fighting spirit to the next generation. They realized one horrifying truth: humanity is not immortal, but they are the temporary immortals. And as long as even one stood, humanity would never be defeated.